as the Israeli military is sort of massing outside the Gaza Strip, and everyone is expecting the ground operation to begin, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have essentially ordered 1.1 million people in Gaza to move from northern Gaza to the south, indicating that the north is, for the moment, the sort of main focus of operations. The problem is that is a movement of half the people in Gaza, which is already an incredibly densely populated space, to the other part of Gaza, which is also incredibly densely populated. So it's an enormous humanitarian challenge, and I think sort of highlights just how dramatic the situation is there on the ground.
Clearly, at the moment, the international community is, certainly the West, Britain, America, other European countries, are supporting Israel, but saying it's got to ensure it operates within international law. It's clearly pushing at the very edges of that, isn't it, with this call to evacuate and presumably, as everyone expects, as a precursor to a major military operation.
I mean, I think you're right that that countries across, especially Europe and of course the United States, are trying to find that balance between very clearly reassuring Israel, very clearly insisting on Israel's right to defend itself. And at the same time, I think a lot of the focus is on how this operation in Gaza can work, how you can go after Hamas without and while minimizing, to at least some extent, the sort of impact on civilians. Now, I think the other main focus of international players, including the UK for that matter, is to do whatever is possible to contain the conflict to southern Israel, to Gaza, and prevent a wider regional conflict, which I think, especially as a ground offensive in Gaza begins, becomes a real danger.
And given what we've seen with diplomats, foreign ministers from around the world, James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, was there this week. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, was in the region as well. Is there any sign that that sort of diplomatic effort is having any effect and sort of trying to dampen this down? I mean, they've done that sort of round of diplomacy, and then Israel's issued this evacuation order.
Well, I think, I don't necessarily think that the international diplomacy, as you mentioned there cleverly, and Secretary of State Blinken, that diplomacy is so much focused on dampening down the war in Gaza. I think the primary focus of those visits is to reassure Israel after what has been the single worst attack on the state of Israel since its existence, and to send a clear message to the region. I think, of course, there's also an effort to do whatever is possible to, like I said, figure out a way to make this operation that is going to come in Gaza, or looks at least very, very likely to come, less impactful on the civilian population. But again, I think it is also just such an intractable problem. I think everyone here is dealing with an absolutely impossible situation.
How significant is it the UK sending 2 Royal Navy ships and surveillance aircraft to the eastern Mediterranean?
I think it's an important move. I think it follows, of course, the US deployment of an aircraft carrier and other assets to the same area. I see those deployments as having sort of 2 types of purpose. One is to reassure Israel and potentially support Israeli operations, at least with intelligence support, perhaps with some ability to detect where hostages might be held and so on, and certainly to support Israel should this escalate further. And the second purpose is to send a clear message of deterrence against actors that might be tempted to become involved in the conflict more directly and therefore lead it to escalate. I'm thinking here in particular of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So, the US presence, the now British presence in the Eastern Mediterranean has two main addressees. One is Hezbollah, the other one is Tehran, trying to make very clear that Israel has international support in the case that this does become a wider regional conflict.
And just finally then, I mean, I know it's hard to predict the future and probably all scenarios are pretty grim. Can you sketch out for us possible scenarios for what might happen in Gaza, in Israel and in the wider region?
Sure. I mean, I think we have right now two main scenarios. The first is that this conflict remains contained to Gaza and southern Israel. Within that scenario, of course, there are multiple scenarios of how the war unfolds. But in any case, it is going to be an incredibly destructive, incredibly deadly war, I'm afraid. And then the second scenario is that ground operation, that war in Gaza, is going to lead to other groups around the region that regard their resistance to Israel, their opposition to Israel, as their sort of raison d'etre. I'm thinking again of Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups in Syria, Iraq, elsewhere, that they see this as something that they can't sit out, that they have to get involved in, that they want to get involved in, and that way the conflict spirals. And if that were to happen, you can quite quickly sort of see an escalation logic, if you will, that spreads and turns this from a war that is geographically contained to Israel and Gaza to one that is that encompasses the wider region.